are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Way to Wow shows. I'm Kevin Bemel, your host, and today, whereas normally on Monday at 10 a.m. I have my show Trust and Estates Weekly, today is Navy Day, the 27th of October, and being a Navy man myself, and see I've got my blue, gold, and silver tie on, which are the three main Navy colors. So I felt like, even though this is a somewhat little known holiday, I have to honor my service branch and bring to you the word of Navy Day. So here we go. By the way, I hope you have your flag out, and if you don't, if you're watching this live, afterwards, go put your flag out. I'm flying my flag today. The fact of the matter is, I look for reasons to fly my flag. I have a beautifully made flag from I think it's called Alliance flag. They're made here in the United States. The craftsmanship is superb. The maple staff on which it's mounted with grommets that allow it to spin in the breeze and not get all wadded up on the staff is just wonderful. And for what it's worth, Alliance flag also are big supporter of the American military and of veterans in particular. So there's a free plug for Alliance flag. So today, as I said, is Navy Day. And so give you some history, as I always do on these special editions, give you some history of the day, and then I have a couple of readings that I want to do. One in particular is I think it's the most powerful reading that's done in any Navy ceremony. It's typically done when a chief petty officer retires. So we'll get to that in a minute. So in the years after World War I, the United States emerged as a global naval power. So throughout the 19th century, the 1800s, really starting with the War of 1812, and if you saw my show, Business Lessons from the Military, I believe it was last week, I talked about the victory on Lake Erie by Oliver Hazard Perry. So that victory by Perry demonstrated to England, or Great Britain, which was far and away the dominant naval power of the 19th century, that at least within the North American realm, the United States Navy could go toe to toe with the British Navy, with the Royal Navy, I should say, and win. Right. And so, but then after the end of World War I, so the United States, which really was the signal factor in the victory of the Allies. So it emerged as a global power, albeit I think somewhat of a reluctant global power, but in for sure a global naval power. And as the United States started stretching her economic reach and becoming even more of an export economy than she'd ever been before, so having a global Navy was very important. The U.S. Navy had grown exponentially during World War I. It had more than 750 ships in commission. By comparison today, that's more than twice the number of ships in commission. So it had over 500,000 sailors and Marines, which is roughly comparable, maybe about 20% more. I think there's roughly 300,000 sailors and 120,000 Marines, I want to say. So maybe about 20% more in terms of personnel. today than there was post World War I. So after the war, public enthusiasm for the Navy remained high. Most Americans were proud of our naval strength, and but there were few official ways to recognize it, and so the Navy League, which was founded in 1902, and full disclosure, I am the president of the Beverly Hills chapter of the Navy League of the United States. You sometimes you see the commercials for the Beverly Hills Navy League on my show, Business Lessons from the Military. I don't do commercials on this show, so you won't see it today. I thought about playing it, but it's not in keeping. But in any event, so it was founded in 1902. It was a civilian organization designed to create interaction between people in the Navy, especially naval leadership and civilians, so they could better understand what the Navy was about. And its main interest was to promote sea power. And so it took up the cause of creating a national day of recognition for the United States Navy and its personnel. And in the event, the first Navy Day occurred on October 27th, 1922. And the reason for the date was twofold. Number one, or I'm sorry, not twofold. I'm sorry. The reason for the date was that October 27th was the birthday of Theodore Roosevelt, who lived from 1858 to 1919. And he was the 26th president of the United States and a former assistant secretary of the Navy. Now, you may be saying, wait a minute, no, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt who was an assistant secretary of the Navy. Both Roosevelt presidents were assistant secretaries of the Navy. And in fact, when Theodore Roosevelt was president, among other things, he championed the Great White Fleet. It was a world cruise from 1907 to 1909, demonstrating U.S. naval power. It was called the Great White Fleet because the ships were painted white. From 1897 to 1898, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt had vigorously supported the modernization and readiness of the Navy with things like larger ships, more powerful power plants for ships, and larger guns for ships, all of the innovations that became part of the Navy in the ensuing couple of decades. And his policy as president was to transform the United States Navy into a first-rate global force. And so in choosing a day for Navy Day, the Navy League of the United States decided to make October 27th the day. And that way the public could directly connect the Navy with its biggest advocate of recent times, and learn about the importance of sea power in terms of national defense and the support of commerce, business, right, of the United States. Excuse me. So, as I mentioned, the first Navy Day was on October 27th, 1922. It was celebrated nationwide. There was enormous enthusiasm for the day. President Warren G. Harding presided over the main event in New York City, reviewing a fleet of more than 50 warships that were anchored in the Hudson River. So, there's been controversy of late over sort of these military parades and sort of demonstration of U.S. military power. These used to be pretty common certainly in the late 19th and into the early, even mid 20th century. So there's nothing new about this. I understand some people feel that it's perhaps gauche or worse, But indeed, this has been a part of American history, and in particular American naval and military history for a long, long time. So the battleships Maryland, Colorado, and Tennessee were among the ships on display. They were among the most advanced ships in the United States Navy at that time. And in ports across the country, or really, I should say, on the two coasts of the country, right? Navy ships were open to the public. They could tour them. Naval bases held tours and ceremonies. Communities hosted parades and patriotic gatherings. It was not unlike kind of a miniature Independence Day celebration, only in this case, it was honoring the United States Navy and her sailors, officers and sailors, as opposed to the nation as a whole. So President Harding issued a message to the nation emphasizing the Navy's role as the sure guardian of peace and a symbol of national honor. Again, there's, I think, controversy today over this idea of peace through strength. People think that President Ronald Reagan created this idea. No, it was around for, you know, decades and decades, if not a century, before Ronald Reagan adopted it as part of his platform, which isn't to diminish what President Reagan did in promoting peace through strength, and in so doing, having a hand in ending the Cold War. Only that this is part of, again, the history of the United States, and certainly of the United States Navy. So in the interwar years, the 1920s and 1930s, the Navy Day served as both a recruiting tool and a public relations event. So as you might imagine, back in those days, there was no Top Gun to excite young people about becoming naval aviators the way it did for decades after the movie was released in the 1980s. So Navy Day kind of filled that bill. And each October 27th, naval vessels were made open for tours in major harbors like New York, Norfolk, which is a huge naval presence even then, San Diego, the same thing, Pearl Harbor, the same thing. New York had the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It had a much, much larger naval presence back in the 20s and 30s than it does today, even though there still is a fleet week in New York, and ships are docked in the port there for people to visit. So in the mid 30s, the day had become an unofficial national holiday, recognized by civic leaders and schools and veterans organizations. Heading into World War II and its peak popularity, of course, World War II, the United States officially entered the war on December 7th, or December 8th, actually, 1941, although we were pretty heavily involved for at least a year and a half or so before that. And of course, it ended in 1945 with victory over Japan in August of that year. So with the onset of World War II, Navy Day took on patriotic significance. So Navy Day 1941, October 27th of that year, took place roughly 6 weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the Navy League of the United States used the day to emphasize readiness and preparedness. Most people who were following world events understood that at some point the United States was going to end up involved in World War II. It wasn't if, it was when. And although Pearl Harbor came as a surprise in terms of it actually happening, that the United States entered into World War II was understood, and there were lots of preparedness and readiness programs going on in 1940 and 1941 that were looking toward that seemingly inevitable date. Navy Day 1945 was perhaps the most famous observance. President Harry S. Truman, who of course had assumed the presidency upon the death of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt early in 1945, shortly after he was inaugurated for his fourth term. He reviewed the fleet in New York Harbor in celebration of the Allied victory in World War II. Over 50 warships and 25,000 sailors and officers participated in that ceremony. And when one considers the role the United States Navy played dominantly in the Pacific theater of operations, but also in the European theater of operations, in particular in the D-Day invasion of Norway on June 6, 1944, I don't think there's much doubt that the United States would not have prevailed but for the strength of the United States Navy. So in his remarks, Truman praised the Navy's role in victory, and he reaffirmed the United States' commitment to maintaining a strong maritime defense in the new atomic age. There were advocates at that time that were claiming that with the advent of the atomic bomb and the dominance of aviation, especially in the European theater, or not the dominance, I should say, but the what was thought to be the effectiveness of aviation in especially the European theater of operations, but in the Pacific theater of operations, naval aviation was indeed dominant, and it confirmed that the battleship was no longer the most powerful naval weapon. Indeed, the aircraft carrier was. So there were a number of people advocating for the shrinkage, if not the dismantling of the Navy and the Marine Corps. They were outmoded because the air forces would be dominant, and of course, we've come to find out that the bombing campaigns, the air bombing campaigns in Europe, were not nearly as effective as they were thought to be during World War II, number one. And number two, there's no evidence to support that a war can be won merely by exercising air dominance or air combat. Inevitably, it takes boots on the ground to do so. President Truman essentially confirming that the United States Navy and by extension, because they're so closely related, the United States Marine Corps would remain central to America's defense posture, signaled good news for the concerned admirals and Marine Corps generals. So Navy Day 1945 was a massive public success. Newspapers across the country devoted front page coverage to the event. Could you imagine something like that today? I just don't think it would ever happen. So in the post-war transition and the rise of Armed Forces Day, 1946 to 1949, so Navy Day started, its impact started to wane. So after World War II, the United States military underwent a significant reorganization and reform. So the National Defense Act of 1947 created the Department of Defense, unifying the Department of the Navy, the Department of the Army, and the newly created and independent and created Department of the Air Force under one overall cabinet level department, the DoD. Okay, the United States Marine Corps remained part of the Department of the Navy. So in 1940, in view of the formation of the Department of Defense, the some of the independence of the individual service branches was lost. One of the things that World War II did is it showed how much more effective the U.S. military could be through joint operations, meaning, for example, in the Pacific theater, when the Navy, Marine Corps, and Army worked together in various and amphibious operations and invasions of islands. So it's thought that or many people think that the Marine Corps was the only amphibious force. No, there were Army units, especially under General Douglas MacArthur, who took part in amphibious operations. And so there was a lot more joint activity in World War II than there had ever been before. And that was, I think, one of the reasons why the Department of Defense was created, to embed that doctrine in national defense strategy and to more effectively train for that. Now, creating a cabinet department doesn't automatically bring something into being. And as I talked about in an episode of Business Lessons from the Military, when I talked about the invasion of Grenada, which took place in the 1980s, when President Reagan was president, there was terrible coordination between the Marine Corps and the Navy and other units. And that really became the impetus for building and creating truly joint operations. So in 1949, Louis A. Johnson, who was the Secretary of Defense under President Truman, he announced the establishment of Armed Forces Day to be held the third Saturday in May. It was a single a holiday to celebrate all of the service branches in the military. So the new holiday was intended to replace Army Day, Air Force Day, and Navy Day. And in fact, I've talked about this on Veterans Day and also on Memorial Day. So there are 3 national holidays to honor people who have or are involved in the military. Memorial Day honors those who have died in the service of their country while in the military. Armed Forces Day honors those currently on active duty in the U.S. military. And Veterans Day honors those who have served but are no longer serving in the United States military. And so while the Department of Defense recognized Armed Forces Day as the sole military appreciation holiday, the Navy League continued to observe August 27th as Navy Day, keeping alive the connection between Theodore Roosevelt and early 20th century naval heritage. So moving on from the 1940s into succeeding decades, in 1972, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Elmo R. Zumwalt, directed the United States Navy to officially celebrate its founding on October 13th, marking the date in 1775 when the Continental Congress established the Continental Navy. And so the U.S. Navy's birthday continues to this day to be celebrated on October 13th, and October 27th remains a traditional Navy Day, still observed by the Navy League and veterans groups and maritime museums and some local communities. So, the Navy Day, therefore, is not an official federal holiday. Nonetheless, it is an opportunity, especially for those of us in the Navy who hold the Navy near and dear in our hearts, to take a day to celebrate our tradition, our love of the Navy, how close we feel to our shipmates, without the other extraneous events that might go on Armed Forces Day, or the confusion between Memorial Day and Veterans Day and all these other things. So, and it's also an opportunity to honor a great leader, Theodore Roosevelt, who was largely responsible on the from the civilian side of ushering the United States Navy into not just modern a modern idiom of how ships operate, but also into the global dominance and key role it plays to this day in keeping sea lanes open so that international commerce can move most efficiently. And that's all due to, well, not all due, but it's President Theodore Roosevelt's leadership that drove that in the earliest years of the 20th century, and that then continued on after that. So, in some years, the president or the secretary of the Navy issues a proclamation or a statement on October 27th, honoring the Navy's role in defending the nation. I don't believe one was issued this year, and that's a shame. But look, that's the way it goes. So, okay, so um, in to honor Navy Day, I'm going to do two readings. The first is Theodore Roosevelt's address at the Naval War College that took place on June 2nd, 1897. Okay, the U.S. Naval War College is located in Newport, Rhode Island. In fact, when I went through officer training and chaplain school back in 2006, it was on Naval Base Newport. Well, I don't think I ever went into the Naval War College. I didn't have reason to do so. I saw it there, and I was on that base. Theodore Roosevelt had been appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy just 3 months earlier by President William McKinley. He was 38 years old at the time. And the United States was in a period of transition. It was emerging from isolation toward global engagement. Tensions with Spain over Cuba were mounting, and American interest in overseas trade and even in some small colonial possessions was growing. So the Naval War College had only been founded a little over a decade before, in 1884. It was the intellectual center of the U.S. Navy, and in particular, the development of U.S. naval strategy. It had been heavily influenced by Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose 1890 book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, Roosevelt had read and enthusiastically promoted. And Mahan's book remains influential to this day, 135 years later. So Roosevelt's address reflected his belief that America's future greatness depended on sea power, preparedness, and moral strength. Now, I'm going to read, this is really a summary. The entire address would be much too long to read. So this is kind of a series of excerpts from the speech that were put together. Chat GPT did this for me. It did an excellent job. And so, like I said, I'm going to read this sort of excerpt, if you will, from President Roosevelt's address, and then I'm gonna come back and talk about some of the themes and ideas and the legacy of it. A century has passed since Washington wrote, "To be prepared for war is the most effectual means to promote peace." We pay to this maxim the lip loyalty we so often pay to Washington's words, but it has never sunk deep into our hearts. Indeed, of late years, many persons have refused it even the poor tribute of lip loyalty, and prayed about the iniquity of war as if somehow that was justification for refusing to take the steps which can alone, in the long run, prevent war or avert the dreadful disasters it brings in its train. The truth of the maxim is so obvious to every man of really far-sighted patriotism that its mere statement seems trite and useless, and it is not over-creditable to either our intelligence or our love of country that there should be, as there is, need to dwell upon and amplify such a truism. In this country, there is not the slightest danger of an overdevelopment of warlike spirit, and there has never been any such danger. In all our history, there has never been a time when preparedness for war was any menace to peace. On the contrary, again and again, we have owed peace to the fact that we were prepared for war, and in the only contest which we have had with a European power since the Revolution, the War of 1812, the struggle and all its attendant disasters were due solely to the fact that we were not prepared to face and were not ready instantly to resent an attack upon our honor and interest, while the glorious triumphs at sea which redeemed that war were due to the few preparations which we had actually made. We are a great peaceful nation, a nation of merchants and manufacturers, of farmers and mechanics, a nation of working men who labor incessantly with head or hand. It is idle to talk of such a nation ever being led into a course of wanton aggression or conflict with military powers by the possession of a sufficient navy. The danger is of precisely the opposite character. If we forget that in the last resort we can only secure peace by being ready and willing to fight for it, we may someday have bitter cause to realize that a rich nation which is slothful, timid, or unwieldy is an easy prey for any people which still retains those most valuable of all qualities, the soldierly virtues. We but keep to the traditions of Washington, to the traditions of all great Americans who struggled for the real greatness of America, when we strive to build up those fighting qualities for the lack of which in a nation, as in an individual, no refinement, no culture, no wealth, no material prosperity can atone. Preparation for war is the surest guarantee for peace. Arbitration is an excellent thing, but ultimately, those who wish to see this country at peace with foreign nations will be wise if they place reliance upon a first class fleet of first class battleships rather than on any arbitration treaty which the wit of man can devise. Nelson said that the British fleet was the best negotiator in Europe, and there was much truth in the saying. Moreover, while we are sincere in and earnest in our advocacy of peace, we must not forget that an ignoble peace is worse than any war. Peace is a goddess only when she comes with sword girt on thigh. The ship of state can be steered safely only when it is possible to bring her against any foe with her leashed thunders gathering for the leap. A really great people, proud and high spirited, would face all the disasters of war rather than purchase the base prosperity which is brought at the price of national honor. All the great masterful races have been fighting races. And the minute that a race loses the hard fighting virtues, then no matter what else it may retain, no matter how skilled in commerce and finance, in science or art, it has lost its proud right to stand as the equal of the best. Cowardice in a race, as in an individual, is the unpardonable sin, and a willful failure to prepare for any danger may, in its effects, be as bad as cowardice. The timid man who cannot fight and the selfish, short-sighted, or foolish man who will not take the steps that will enable him to fight stand on almost the same plane. This nation cannot stand still if it is to retain its self-respect and to keep undimmed the honorable traditions inherited from the men who with the sword founded it and by the sword preserved it. No nation should ever wage war wantonly, but no nation should ever avoid it at the cost of the loss of national honor. A nation should never fight unless forced, but it should always be ready to fight. The mere fact that it is ready will generally spare it the necessity of fighting. If in the future we have war, it will only almost certainly come because of some action or lack of action on our part in the way of refusing to accept the responsibilities at the proper time or failing to prepare for war when war does not threaten. An ignoble peace is even worse than an unsuccessful war. But an unsuccessful war would leave behind it a legacy of bitter memories which would hurt our national development for a generation to come. So it's interesting to note, and I think this is not well known. Theodore Roosevelt wrote a number of books, including a history of the War of 1812. So he was on a scholarly level very knowledgeable about kind of the turning point when the United States Navy, as I mentioned at the beginning, was able to take on the role of defending the United States against the greatest naval power of the early 19th century, the Royal Navy. So he had that background, among other aspects, that allowed him to speak credibly on this topic. So the themes of his address: peace through strength, right? A good navy is not a provocation to war. It is the surest guarantee of peace. The moral obligation of readiness. The moral obligation of readiness. It is foolish and wrong to shrink from doing our duty in peace or in war. The surest way to invite disaster is to be unready to meet it. Okay? The Navy as an instrument of character, national character, as well as civic virtue and the individual character of not only the sailors and officers who serve in the Navy, but the citizens of the country. So he saw the kind of he saw the naval service as a forge for discipline and courage and that civic virtue about which I just spoke. He critiqued complacency. No triumph of peace is quite so great as the supreme triumph of war won for a righteous cause. Okay, and righteous cause from Roosevelt's standpoint was the defense of liberty, not the warmongering conquest that was not uncommon among European powers. And finally, you can see the Mahanian influence in the talk when Roosevelt talks about when he talks about control of the seas as equal to control of the destiny of a nation. So all of these were themes that he developed. The reception and impact of his address, of course, it was warmly received by the officers at the Naval War College, who admired Roosevelt's energy and his intellect. It was published in naval journals and newspapers, calling national attention to his words and his views on preparedness. Within a year, the Spanish-American War in 1898 would vindicate Roosevelt's call for readiness. The United States Navy's swift victory at Manila Bay and Santiago demonstrated the truth of his warnings. And of course, Roosevelt himself resigned his civilian post to form the Rough Riders, enhancing his national reputation and paving the way to the presidency in 1901. The legacy of Roosevelt's 1897 address is it really marks the philosophical foundation of American naval power, American sea power, linking deterrence, moral purpose, and global engagement, all in one overall ideal. So the institutional legacy of the speech, it led to the building and world cruise of the Great White Fleet, which I mentioned earlier, 1907 through 1909. It expanded the Navy's size, its professionalism, its global presence. New naval bases were built, and along with coaling stations, so that the United States Navy, which was now a steamship-based navy, and coal was the fuel that was used to power it in the early 1900s, was built. And again, it cemented America's role as a maritime power. Even, it can. So I think Roosevelt's address, while it certainly continues to be studied at the Naval War College, it remains relevant today because of its strategic realism, its moral leadership, and its idea of a continuity of duty, that every generation stands the watch for succeeding generations. And it is this idea with which I'm going to close by reading a traditional naval reading called The Watch. Rarely do I get through this without tearing up. I've heard it read a number of times at retirement ceremonies for chief petty officers in which I've participated, or in which I've been a guest. It is an enormously powerful reading. I don't think as a naval officer I can quite give it the justice that a chief petty officer can. So with apologies to all my chief petty officer shipmates out there, this is done to honor the United States Navy, what's known as the GOAT locker, which is all the chief petty officers in the Navy, and indeed all of our shipmates. And so I'm going to close with a reading of The Watch. I'm sorry. Just real quickly. So before I do the reading, so its origins are uncertain, but it likely dates to the Cold War era, the 1950s or 60s, and of course, it captures the Navy's sense of duty and continuity. Okay, so I'm going to end today's show with this reading of The Watch. For 20 years, this sailor has stood the watch. While some of us were in our bunks at night, this sailor stood the watch. While some of us were in school learning our trade, this shipmate stood the watch. Yes, even before some of us were born, this shipmate stood the watch. In those years, when the storm clouds of war were seen brewing on the horizon of history, this shipmate stood the watch. Many times he would cast an eye ashore and see his family standing there, needing his guidance and help, needing his hand to hold during those hard times. But this sailor stood the watch. He stood the watch for 20 years. He stood the watch so that we, our families, and our fellow countrymen could sleep soundly in safety each and every night, knowing that a sailor stood the watch. Today, we are here to say, shipmate, the watch stands relieved. Relieved by those you have trained, guided, and led. Shipmate, you stand relieved. We have the watch. Bosun, stand by to pipe the side. Shipmate, going ashore. Didn't make it through that time either. I thank you so much for joining me on this Navy Day. I hope that you will fly your American flag with pride and think about all of my shipmates who have served the United States Navy with honor, with distinction, with the intention to do just what the watch speaks about, to protect and defend our country so that you, our fellow citizens, could live quiet, safe, decent lives. So thanks again for joining me. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times.